September 14th, 1997. The morning bells of Santa Maria Convent rang out across the misty hills of rural Oregon, just as they had every day for the past 70 years. But on this particular Sunday, something was different. Something was terribly wrong. Sister Katherine Wilson, a dedicated member of the religious community for over a decade, failed to appear for morning prayers. At 34 years old, Katherine was known for her punctuality and devotion. Her absence immediately raised concerns among the other sisters. "So glad to have you here. Comment your city so I can bring cases from your region and also know where you're watching me from." When the Mother Superior sent someone to check on her, they discovered Katherine's room untouched. The bed was neatly made, her personal Bible remained on the nightstand, and her habit hung carefully in the closet. Everything suggested she had simply vanished into thin air. The local sheriff's department arrived within the hour. Deputies began searching the extensive convent grounds, which sprawled across 50 acres of forested hillside. Search dogs were brought in, combing through the dense woods surrounding the property. Volunteers from the nearby town joined the effort, calling out Katherine's name through the Oregon wilderness. Father Thomas Bennett, the convent's chaplain for the past 5 years, appeared visibly shaken by the news. He had been serving the community faithfully, conducting masses and providing spiritual guidance. The priest immediately offered to help coordinate the search efforts, showing what seemed like genuine concern for the missing nun. As investigators interviewed the other sisters, a pattern began to emerge. Katherine had seemed distracted in recent weeks. She spent long hours in the convent's administrative office, where she managed financial records and historical archives. Some sisters recalled seeing her staying late, reviewing old documents by lamplight. Katherine's family drove up from California the moment they received the news. Her older brother, Michael Wilson, a schoolteacher from Sacramento, struggled to understand how his sister could simply disappear from a place of supposed safety and sanctuary. The family had always been proud of Katherine's calling to religious life, believing the convent would provide her with security and purpose. Days turned into weeks with no sign of Katherine. The investigation expanded beyond the convent grounds. Police checked bus stations, interviewed travelers, and examined security footage from nearby towns. Every lead went nowhere. There were no witnesses, no suspicious vehicles, no indications of where Katherine might have gone or what might have happened to her. The diocese released a statement expressing concern and calling for prayers. Local news outlets covered the story extensively at first, but as time passed without developments, media attention began to fade. The case grew cold, becoming another unsolved mystery in the files of the county sheriff's department. But one detail continued to trouble investigators. Just 3 days before her disappearance, Katherine had confided in Sister Mary Elizabeth, an elderly nun who had been her mentor. Katherine mentioned discovering something troubling in the parish financial records, something that concerned her deeply. She had planned to discuss the matter with church authorities. Sister Mary Elizabeth would later recall the worry in Katherine's eyes during that conversation, a fear she hadn't fully understood at the time. It was a memory that would haunt her for years to come, a fragment of truth buried beneath the surface of an inexplicable vanishing. As autumn leaves began to fall across the convent grounds, the searches gradually diminished. The case remained open, but hope of finding Katherine Wilson alive grew dimmer with each passing day. Something dark had touched the peaceful sanctuary of Santa Maria Convent, leaving behind only questions and a profound sense of loss. And in the shadows of the investigation, certain details remained overlooked, waiting in silence for someone to connect the pieces of a puzzle that would take 15 years to solve. The investigation into Sister Katherine Wilson's disappearance continued through the winter of 1997, but momentum steadily declined. By early 1998, the case had been reassigned to a single detective who managed dozens of other open investigations. The trail had gone completely cold. Michael Wilson refused to accept the silence. Katherine's brother became a persistent voice, calling the sheriff's department weekly, organizing awareness campaigns, and distributing missing person flyers throughout Oregon and neighboring states. He created a small fund offering a reward for information, but no credible tips materialized. The Wilson family struggled to find closure. Katherine's elderly parents held on to hope that their daughter might return, perhaps suffering from amnesia or choosing a new life away from religious service. But Michael knew his sister better. Katherine had been devoted to her calling. She would never have left without explanation. In the summer of 1999, Father Thomas Bennett was quietly transferred to another diocese. The official explanation cited the need for his services elsewhere, a common occurrence in the Catholic Church's system of reassignments. He departed Santa Maria Convent with little fanfare, moving to a rural parish 300 miles away. As investigators later discovered, Katherine Wilson had been more than just a devoted nun. She possessed a sharp mind for numbers and organization. Her role managing the convent's financial records had given her access to decades of documentation, including donation records, property transactions, and internal church finances. In the months before her disappearance, Katherine had noticed irregularities. Donation amounts didn't match deposit records. Funds designated for convent maintenance seemed to vanish from the accounts. She had begun documenting these discrepancies in a personal notebook, careful records that she kept separate from official files. Sister Mary Elizabeth, now elderly and struggling with her own health, began experiencing troubling memories. She recalled Katherine mentioning specific concerns about financial management. The young nun had spoken of planning to report her findings to the diocesan office, wanting to ensure everything was handled properly and transparently. But Katherine never made that report. 3 days after confiding in Sister Mary Elizabeth, she was gone. The convent itself underwent changes. New administrators arrived, implementing updated accounting systems. The old financial records were archived, boxed up and stored in the basement of the main building. Life at Santa Maria Convent continued, though the memory of Katherine Wilson's disappearance cast a long shadow over the community. By 2003, the original detective assigned to Katherine's case retired. The file was transferred to storage, joining thousands of other unsolved cases in the county archives. Occasionally, a new investigator would review the materials, hoping fresh eyes might spot something missed. But the evidence remained frustratingly sparse. Father Thomas Bennett continued his work in his new parish, building relationships with a different congregation. To outward appearances, he was a dedicated priest, serving his community faithfully. Nobody in his new location knew about the missing nun from his previous assignment. The Wilson family marked each anniversary of Katherine's disappearance with a memorial service. Michael never stopped believing that answers existed somewhere, waiting to be discovered. He maintained contact with the sheriff's department, checking periodically for any developments. In 2007, advances in forensic technology prompted a brief review of Katherine's case. Investigators wondered if new methods might reveal evidence that earlier techniques had missed. But without physical evidence or a crime scene, there was little the technology could accomplish. The abandoned chapel on the convent grounds gradually fell into disrepair. The small stone building, once used for private meditation and prayer, was no longer maintained. Vegetation grew wild around its foundation. The heavy wooden door remained locked, the interior dark and forgotten. Beneath that chapel's stone floor, secrets remained buried. The earth held truths that would stay hidden for years, waiting for the right moment, the right investigator, and the right tools to bring them back into the light. As the case approached its 10th anniversary, Katherine Wilson's disappearance seemed destined to remain an eternal mystery. But sometimes, justice simply requires patience and persistence. Sometimes, the truth has a way of refusing to stay buried forever, no matter how deeply it has been hidden or how much time has passed. Spring 2012. 15 years had passed since Sister Katherine Wilson vanished from Santa Maria Convent. The case file had gathered dust in the archives, seemingly forgotten by everyone except the Wilson family, who continued their quiet vigil for answers that seemed destined never to come. Detective Sarah Mitchell had recently joined the cold case unit of the county sheriff's department. At 32 years old, she brought fresh energy and modern investigative techniques to cases that had long been abandoned. Mitchell had a particular interest in missing persons investigations, having lost a cousin under mysterious circumstances during her childhood. When Mitchell began reviewing the Wilson case, something immediately caught her attention. The investigation had been thorough for its time, but 15 years of technological advancement offered new possibilities. DNA analysis had improved dramatically. Geographic profiling techniques had evolved. And perhaps most significantly, Cadaver detection methods had become far more sophisticated. Mitchell noted that the original search had focused primarily on the surrounding forest and nearby roads. The convent grounds themselves had been examined, but not with the specialized tools now available. She submitted a request to bring in a cadaver detection dog team, specifically trained to locate human remains even after many years. The request was approved in early April. A handler named Robert Chen arrived with Zeus, a German shepherd with an exceptional track record in locating remains at historical sites. Chen explained that dogs like Zeus could detect human decomposition compounds in soil even decades after burial, under the right conditions. The search began on a cool morning, with morning fog still clinging to the hillsides. Zeus worked methodically across the convent property, his handler watching carefully for any signs of interest. For hours, the dog moved through gardens, wooded areas, and open fields without significant reaction. Then they reached the abandoned chapel. The small stone structure stood at the far edge of the property, its windows dark, its door secured with a rusted padlock. Vegetation had grown thick around the foundation, and the path leading to it had nearly disappeared beneath encroaching wilderness. Zeus's behavior changed immediately. The dog became intensely focused, circling the chapel entrance repeatedly. He scratched at the ground near the foundation, whining with an urgency that Chen recognized instantly. This was a strong indication, the kind that demanded immediate attention. Mitchell obtained permission to enter the building. The Mother Superior provided keys to the old padlock, expressing surprise that anyone would want to examine the long-abandoned structure. The chapel hadn't been used for services in over a decade, she explained. It had been deemed too expensive to maintain and too small to justify the cost. Inside, the chapel was exactly as one might expect from years of neglect. Dust covered every surface. Spiderwebs stretched across corners. The wooden pews showed signs of water damage from a leaking roof, but Zeus showed no interest in the interior space. His focus remained on the area near the altar. Mitchell examined the stone floor carefully. Unlike the rest of the chapel, the area directly beneath and around the altar showed subtle signs of disturbance. The stones didn't quite align properly. The mortar between them appeared newer in some sections than in others. To an untrained eye, these details might seem insignificant, but to an experienced investigator, they told a story. A ground-penetrating radar unit was brought to the site the following day. The technology could detect disturbances in soil and unusual objects buried beneath surfaces. When the operator ran the equipment over the chapel floor, the results were unmistakable. There was a significant anomaly beneath the altar, a void in the earth that shouldn't exist under a century-old stone floor. Mitchell obtained a warrant to excavate. The process began carefully, with archaeologically trained technicians removing the stones piece by piece, documenting everything with photographs and detailed notes. As they worked deeper, the soil beneath showed clear evidence of having been disturbed and refilled, likely many years ago. Church records were pulled from the archives. Mitchell discovered that in the summer of 1997, just months before Katherine's disappearance, the abandoned chapel had undergone partial renovation work. The project had been supervised personally by Father Thomas Bennett. He had arranged for materials to be delivered and had worked on the chapel largely alone, explaining that he wanted to restore the space as a personal meditation retreat. The renovation had never been completed. After Father Bennett's transfer in 1999, the project was abandoned and the chapel was locked and forgotten. As the excavation continued deeper beneath the altar stones, the technicians suddenly stopped their work. They had encountered something. Detective Mitchell was called over immediately. There, emerging from the Oregon earth after 15 years of darkness, were the unmistakable remains of a human skeleton, still partially clothed in the black fabric of a religious habit. Summer 2012. The discovery beneath Santa Maria Convent's abandoned chapel sent shockwaves through the community and reignited a case that many had assumed would never be solved. The skeletal remains were carefully excavated and transported to the State Forensic Laboratory for analysis. Michael Wilson received the call he had been waiting 15 years to hear, though not in the way he had hoped. His sister Katherine had been found. She had never left the convent grounds. She had been there all along, buried beneath a place of prayer and worship, hidden in darkness while life continued above. The forensic examination began immediately. Despite the passage of time, the remains were in relatively good condition due to the cool, dry environment beneath the stone floor. The religious habit found with the body matched those worn by the Sisters of Santa Maria Convent in 1997. Dental records provided initial confirmation, but DNA analysis would offer definitive proof. Within 2 weeks, the laboratory confirmed what everyone already suspected. The remains were those of Sister Katherine Wilson. She had been 34 years old when she died. And crucially, the forensic pathologist identified evidence of blunt force trauma to the skull, indicating that Katherine's death had not been natural or accidental. Detective Mitchell assembled every piece of information available about the weeks surrounding Katherine's disappearance. She studied the timeline carefully, noting who had access to the chapel, who had the knowledge to carry out a burial beneath the stone floor, and who might have had a motive. Father Thomas Bennett's name appeared repeatedly in the investigation notes. He had been the chaplain at the time of Katherine's disappearance. He had supervised the chapel renovation work. He had arranged for the delivery of materials including bags of mortar and concrete. And most significantly, he had worked on the project alone, often late into the evening, declining offers of help from others in the community. Financial records from 1997 revealed troubling patterns. Katherine had been responsible for managing the convent's accounts and had access to all financial documentation. In the months before her death, she had made copies of numerous records, meticulously documenting transactions that appeared irregular. Investigators discovered that substantial funds had been transferred from convent accounts to various destinations over a period of years. Some of the transactions had been disguised as legitimate expenses, payments for supplies and services that were never actually delivered. Other funds had simply vanished from the records entirely. Mitchell obtained a warrant to search the current residence of Father Thomas Bennett, now 68 years old and serving at a small parish 300 miles from Santa Maria Convent. The search also included his former living quarters at the convent, which had been occupied by subsequent chaplains but still contained some storage areas with Bennett's old possessions. The search of the convent quarters yielded an unexpected discovery. Behind a built-in bookshelf in what had been Bennett's private study, investigators found a small hidden compartment. Inside was a collection of documents, financial records from the late 1990s, and most significantly, a notebook filled with Katherine Wilson's handwriting. The notebook contained detailed observations about financial discrepancies Katherine had discovered. She had documented irregular transactions, unexplained withdrawals, and donation records that didn't match actual deposits. The entries spanned several months, showing Katherine's growing concern about what she was uncovering. The final entry in the notebook was dated September 11, 1997, just 3 days before Katherine's disappearance. In it, she wrote about her decision to report her findings to the diocesan office. She expressed hope that the matter could be resolved quietly and appropriately, but she was clear that the irregularities needed to be addressed. Interviews with former members of the convent community provided additional context. Several sisters recalled heated discussions between Father Bennett and Katherine in the days before she vanished. One witness remembered seeing Bennett emerge from Katherine's office looking angry, his face flushed with emotion. Another recalled Katherine appearing troubled and withdrawn during her final week. The chapel renovation timeline aligned perfectly with the theory developing in Mitchell's mind. Father Bennett had begun the renovation project in June 1997, 3 months before Katherine disappeared. He had specifically requested permission to work on restoring the area beneath and around the altar. He had arranged for the delivery of materials that would be necessary to break through the stone floor, create a burial space, and then carefully restore the appearance of the floor afterward. Banking records showed that Bennett had maintained a personal account with deposits that seemed inconsistent with a priest's modest salary. Some of the deposits corresponded with timeframes when convent funds had gone missing. The pattern suggested a systematic embezzlement operation that had continued for years. Mitchell contacted the diocese where Bennett currently served. Church officials expressed shock at the allegations, but confirmed that Bennett had served without incident for over a decade. He was respected in his current community, known for his dedication and pastoral care. None of his current parishioners suspected the dark secret he carried. As the evidence accumulated, the prosecutor's office began building a case. They had human remains showing signs of violence. They They had financial motive. They had opportunity and exclusive access to the burial location. They had Katherine's notebook documenting her intention to expose the embezzlement. And they had forensic evidence from the chapel excavation linking the burial to the time frame when Bennett had control of the location. An arrest warrant was prepared for Father Thomas Bennett on charges of murder and concealment of a body. Detective Mitchell reviewed the evidence one final time, ensuring every element was properly documented and legally obtained. 15 years after Katherine Wilson disappeared, justice was finally within reach. But as Mitchell prepared to make the arrest, she knew the hardest part was still ahead. Getting Bennett to reveal what really happened that September night in 1997, and ensuring that the evidence would hold up in court to deliver the justice that Katherine and her family deserved. October 2012. The arrest of Father Thomas Bennett took place on a quiet Tuesday morning at his rural parish, 300 miles from Santa Maria Convent. Detective Sarah Mitchell arrived with a team of officers prepared for any possibility. Bennett was leading a morning service when they arrived, and investigators waited respectfully until the small congregation had departed before approaching him. Bennett showed no visible surprise when presented with the warrant. His face remained composed, almost serene, as the charges were read. He declined to make any statement, invoking his right to legal counsel immediately. The man who had lived with his secret for 15 years would not break easily. The arrest made national headlines. Media outlets covered the story extensively, drawing attention to the cold case that had finally been solved through modern forensic techniques and persistent investigation. The Catholic Church issued statements expressing shock and cooperation with law enforcement. The diocese announced it would conduct its own internal review of Bennett's financial activities during his tenure at Santa Maria Convent. Bennett's defense attorney, a respected criminal lawyer named Patricia Morrison, immediately began building a case that challenged the prosecution's evidence. She argued that the connection between her client and Katherine Wilson's death was circumstantial. Yes, Bennett had worked on the chapel renovation. Yes, he had access to the location. But did that prove he had murdered Katherine Wilson and buried her body there? Morrison contended that someone else could have used the renovation as an opportunity to commit the crime. The prosecution knew their case rested heavily on establishing motive and opportunity. They needed to demonstrate not just that Bennett could have committed the murder, but that he had compelling reasons to do so. The financial evidence became crucial to building that narrative. Forensic accountants were brought in to analyze the convent's financial records from the 1990s. Their findings painted a disturbing picture. Over a period of approximately 6 years, more than $200,000 had been diverted from convent accounts through various schemes. Donations had been pocketed. Expenses had been inflated with the difference going elsewhere. Checks had been written for services never rendered. The accountants traced some of these funds to Bennett's personal accounts. Other money had been withdrawn as cash, making it impossible to track the final destination. But the pattern was clear and consistent. Bennett had been systematically stealing from the religious community he was supposed to serve. Katherine Wilson's notebook provided the roadmap showing exactly what she had discovered. Her meticulous documentation matched the accountant's findings with remarkable accuracy. She had identified the same suspicious transactions, the same unexplained discrepancies, the same pattern of financial manipulation. Katherine had been closing in on the truth, and her notes made clear she intended to report everything to church authorities. Meanwhile, investigators continued searching for additional evidence. The former living quarters at Santa Maria Convent yielded more discoveries. Behind the hidden compartment where Katherine's notebook had been found, forensic technicians discovered trace evidence. Luminol testing revealed microscopic blood traces on the floor of what had been Bennett's private study. DNA analysis confirmed the blood belonged to Katherine Wilson. The implications were staggering. Katherine had died in Bennett's study at the convent, not in the chapel where she was buried. The chapel had simply been the burial site, chosen because Bennett already had a legitimate reason to be disturbing the ground there. The renovation project had been his cover, perhaps planned in advance, perhaps opportunistically used after, in confrontation with Katherine, had turned violent. Investigators theorized about what had happened that September night in 1997. Katherine had likely confronted Bennett about her findings. Perhaps she had given him a chance to explain, hoping there was some reasonable explanation for the financial irregularities. The confrontation had taken place in Bennett's study, away from other members of the community. Something had gone terribly wrong. Whether Bennett had struck Katherine in sudden anger or had coldly calculated that killing her was the only way to protect his secret, the result was the same. Katherine had suffered fatal head trauma in that room. And then Bennett had been faced with the challenge of disposing of the evidence. The chapel renovation had provided the solution. Bennett had access to the building. He had the tools and materials needed to break through the stone floor. He could work alone at night without drawing suspicion. Over the course of several hours, probably working through the darkness, he had dug Katherine's grave beneath the altar, placed her body there, and then carefully restored the floor to hide any sign of disturbance. The prosecutor's office assembled a timeline showing Bennett's activities in the days following Katherine's disappearance. He had been observed making multiple trips to the chapel late at night. He had requested additional supplies for the renovation, including extra mortar and concrete. He had declined offers of help from others who wanted to assist with the project. Every action was consistent with someone hiding evidence of a crime. As the trial date approached, the defense continued to maintain Bennett's innocence. Morrison argued that the prosecution's timeline was speculative, that the blood evidence could have innocent explanations, and that other suspects had never been properly investigated. She pointed out that the convent had been accessible to many people and that focusing exclusively on Bennett was premature. But the evidence continued to accumulate. Former colleagues from Santa Maria Convent came forward with memories they had suppressed for years. One sister recalled Bennett behaving strangely in the weeks after Katherine's disappearance, appearing haggard and stressed. Another remembered him being unusually insistent that the chapel renovation be completed quickly, even though there was no pressing deadline. The diocese's internal investigation revealed additional financial irregularities at parishes where Bennett had served both before and after his time at Santa Maria Convent. The pattern of embezzlement appeared to span his entire career, suggesting that Katherine had stumbled upon just one chapter of a much longer story of betrayal and theft. Michael Wilson prepared to attend every day of the trial. After 15 years of questions, he would finally hear the full truth about what had happened to his sister. The Wilson family had endured years of uncertainty, wondering if Katherine was alive somewhere, hoping against hope that she might return. Now they knew the worst, but they also had the possibility of justice. As jury selection began, the weight of evidence seemed overwhelming. But in the American justice system, overwhelming evidence must still be proven beyond reasonable doubt. The question remained whether 12 citizens would find that burden of proof satisfied, and whether Father Thomas Bennett would finally face consequences for the crime he had concealed for 15 years beneath the floor of an abandoned chapel. Winter 2013. The trial of Father Thomas Bennett began on a cold January morning in the county courthouse. The case had attracted significant public attention, and the courtroom was filled with spectators, journalists, and members of both the religious community and Katherine Wilson's family. The prosecution opened with a comprehensive presentation of evidence. They walked the jury through Katherine's role at Santa Maria Convent, her discovery of financial irregularities, and her documented intention to report her findings. They presented the timeline of Bennett's chapel renovation project and its suspicious alignment with Katherine's disappearance. Forensic experts testified about the excavation beneath the chapel floor, describing the careful burial that had kept Katherine's remains hidden for 15 years. The pathologist explained the skull fracture that had caused her death, making clear this was not an accident or natural causes. The blood evidence from Bennett's former study was presented, with DNA experts confirming the match to Katherine. Financial experts detailed the embezzlement scheme, showing the jury exactly how Bennett had stolen from the convent over many years. Katherine's notebook was introduced as evidence, her own handwriting documenting the investigation that had cost her life. Each page represented another piece of truth she had uncovered, another step closer to exposing Bennett's crimes. The prosecution called witnesses who had known both Katherine and Bennett in 1997. Sisters from the convent testified about Katherine's dedication, her attention to detail, and her integrity. They described her as someone who would never have ignored financial impropriety, who would have felt morally obligated to report wrongdoing regardless of personal risk. Other witnesses recalled Bennett's behavior in the days surrounding Catherine's disappearance. His agitation, his insistence on working alone at the chapel, his sudden departure from the convent just 2 years later, despite having served there for 5 years. The cumulative effect of the testimony painted a picture of a man with motive, means, and opportunity. The defense strategy focused on creating reasonable doubt. Patricia Morrison argued that the prosecution's case was built on circumstantial evidence and speculation. She pointed out that no witnesses had actually seen Bennett harm Katherine. No murder weapon had been recovered. No confession had been obtained. The blood in his study could have come from any number of innocent incidents over the years he lived there. Morrison emphasized that Bennett had never been charged with embezzlement at the time, suggesting that Katherine's findings might have been mistaken or incomplete. She argued that someone else could have known about the chapel renovation and used it as an opportunity to frame Bennett. The defense called character witnesses who testified to Bennett's years of dedicated service at his subsequent parish. But the prosecution countered effectively in rebuttal. They demonstrated that Bennett was the only person with complete access to both the study where Katherine died and the chapel where she was buried. They showed that his financial records contained unexplained deposits consistent with the stolen funds. They presented evidence that Bennett had specifically requested to work alone on the chapel project, refusing help even when others offered. The trial lasted 3 weeks. Both sides presented closing arguments that summarized their cases and appealed to the jury's sense of justice and reason. The prosecution emphasized the weight of evidence, the careful investigation, and the truth that had finally emerged after 15 years. The defense urged the jury to require absolute proof, to resist the temptation of assumptions, and to remember that doubt must favor the accused. The jury deliberated for 3 days. During that time, Michael Wilson waited anxiously, knowing that his family's long search for justice depended on the decisions of 12 strangers. The Wilson family had maintained their dignity and composure throughout the trial, but the strain was evident on every face. When the jury returned, the courtroom fell silent. The forewoman stood and delivered the verdicts. Father Thomas Bennett was found guilty of second-degree murder in the death of Sister Katherine Wilson. He was found guilty of concealing a corpse. The additional charges of embezzlement were also sustained based on the financial evidence presented. Bennett's expression remained unchanged as the verdicts were read. He showed no emotion, no reaction, maintaining the same controlled demeanor he had displayed throughout the proceedings. Whether this reflected genuine lack of remorse or simply careful legal strategy, only Bennett himself knew. The sentencing hearing took place 2 weeks later. The judge heard statements from Katherine's family, describing the impact of her loss and the agony of 15 years without answers. Michael Wilson spoke about his sister's kindness, her faith, and the senseless tragedy of her death. The Wilson parents, now elderly and frail, could barely contain their grief as they faced the man who had taken their daughter from them. The judge sentenced Bennett to 25 years to life in prison for the murder conviction. Additional consecutive sentences were added for concealing the body and for the embezzlement charges. At 68 years old, Bennett would almost certainly spend the remainder of his life behind bars. The Catholic Church issued statements expressing sorrow for Katherine's death and apologizing to her family. The diocese announced sweeping reforms to financial oversight and background screening procedures. Santa Maria Convent established a memorial garden in Katherine's honor, a place of peace and reflection where her memory would be preserved. The Wilson family was finally able to lay Katherine to rest properly. A funeral service was held at Santa Maria Convent, attended by hundreds of people whose lives she had touched. Her burial took place in the convent cemetery, under open sky and surrounded by the community she had loved and served. Detective Sarah Mitchell received recognition for her persistence in solving the cold case. Her work had demonstrated the value of modern forensic techniques combined with thorough investigation. The case became a teaching example in law enforcement training, showing how advances in technology could bring justice even decades after a crime. The abandoned chapel at Santa Maria Convent was eventually demolished. The site was transformed into a meditation garden, ensuring that the location where Katherine had been hidden would become a place of beauty and remembrance, rather than darkness and sorrow. 15 years had passed between Katherine Wilson's disappearance and the resolution of her case. 15 years of questions, grief, and uncertainty for her family. But through persistence, modern forensics, and the dedication of investigators who refused to let the case remain forgotten, truth had finally emerged from beneath the stones where it had been buried. Justice had been delayed, but justice had been served. Sister Katherine Wilson's murder had been solved, her killer had been held accountable, and her memory had been honored. In the end, even the most carefully hidden secrets could not remain buried forever. The truth, like Katherine's own faith, had proven stronger than the darkness that had tried to conceal it.